been talking all along about the funds and how we do our accounting when the transactions first occur within the proper fund. And that's what we've been talking about so far in the last few chapters. Now we're going to talk about how we take the end results from each of those funds and consolidate them up into the governmental wide statements. So those two statements that report out the whole government. So to do that, we have to do a little bit of worksheet magic. Now I'm not going to expect you to complete a whole worksheet for this class, but just kind of understand like why we're putting things on the worksheet and the point of that. All right, so here we go. We're going to talk about how we get those fund statements, the numbers on the fund statements, to become the numbers on the government-wide statement as well. So I want you to understand the necessary steps. So you're not going to really prepare the worksheet entries, but you'll kind of know the point behind them and what we're doing. And we will record some events related to capital assets and long-term debt. If you'll recall, as we were doing those governmental funds, some of them did have relations to capital assets. For example, a special revenue fund might be used to do something that gets a capital asset. Certainly a capital projects fund, the end result would be a capital asset of some kind. But you might have noticed in those governmental funds, we didn't report out the actual end result, the actual courthouse building or whatever it was, as an asset. Those governmental funds were just for the current operating year. So we have to make sure we're getting that long-term stuff out there on the government-wide. All right, so hopefully you've read your book and you've looked at some of the exhibits. And so you understand that at the end of the year, we're going to take all those transactions we've been keeping track of in the funds and report them out on these government-wide statements, right? So that basically involves, for the governmental funds, you have to take them and switch those numbers from modified accrual to accrual basis, so everything's reporting out the same way. And of course you have to include in things that aren't in those funds, like the capital assets, their depreciation, stuff like that. The long-term liabilities. We combine the internal service funds, which, if you'll recall, the internal service funds are accounted for within the proprietary funds. But when we report them out as governmental, because that's really what they are. They're not really servicing anybody outside. They're not business-like entities. So we're kind of going to add those over to the governmental funds as we report, not actually literally do transactions to add them into those funds. They're still their separate funds, but when we report them out, we got to calculate on the worksheet how we'll report them out. And of course, you consolidate the fund statements into one big statement. Other than fiduciary funds, we haven't really gotten too much into those because, quite frankly, they mostly involve pensions and a few various trusts with some interesting accounting, certainly, but they don't go in the government-wide statements. They don't belong to the government, so I took the opportunity to leave them out for the summer class. Okay, so here's a little schematic that just sort of gives you an idea of how this all works. So, as you know, all through the year we've been keeping track of the funds, right? So we have the fund-based financial statements for governmental activities. We have them for proprietary activities, and we have them for fiduciary activities, right? So we've prepared our pension statements and those kind of things, and they just stay there. That's it. We've paid our benefits, we've calculated our asset value, and done all that, and so that just is it. So we're not going to worry about them anymore because they don't get included in the government-wide statements. But now we're going to deal with our governmental and our proprietary funds. And what we need to do is get these up into our government-wide statements, right? So we have our statement of net position and statement of activities that we report out across the whole government. And so what do we do? Well, if you'll recall, the proprietary funds have both the internal service funds and the enterprise funds, right? So enterprise funds, those are things like the water department, the electricity department, something that charges fees to people outside the government, right? It's just like a business that's within the government, and they're actually charging people fees, so water, waste collection, things like that. Right. So those are kept on accrual basis, right? So you just take the numbers from those enterprise funds and stick them right on the financial statements for government-wide. The governmental funds, those numbers have to be converted, right? So we use a worksheet and we calculate, well, if we had done this accrual basis, what would those numbers be, right? And so we hold on to those numbers, and we come over here to these proprietary funds, and we say, well, those internal service funds, those are really governmental, because the internal service funds, if you'll recall, those are things like the motor pool, maybe purchasing, something that the government entities use across, right? So everybody uses the janitorial service from the janitorial internal service fund. So the same group takes care of cleaning the police station, the jail, the courthouse, the city hall, and everybody just kind of transfers some money into that fund, but it's internal. So those are technically governmental activities, not enterprise activities, because enterprise activities people pay on the outside are paying funds for. So what we do is, once we've translated the modified accrual numbers to accrual numbers, and we take the IS internal service funds, they're on accrual basis. So then now we just can take the change numbers and add the service fund numbers, and then they can go up on the statements. Okay, so that worksheet, right? So this worksheet that we use to make these changes, what does that do? Okay, so I'm not going to really expect you to fill out a worksheet, but kind of understand we're converting governmental funds to accrual basis, and so we have to calculate that and then come up with a totals column, right? So certainly you take the accounts in the governmental fund and you put them in a column, right? Here's the balances in the governmental funds, right? Then you've got your debit and credit columns where you enter your journal entries to convert to accrual basis. So, you know, you're going to change anything that's modified accrual to accrual. And remember, your internal service funds comes from the proprietary funds, so you just bring those up. They're already accrual basis, so you don't have to do any adjustments to them. And so now you end up with a total column that you can add and subtract all the way across, depending on if you've got debits or credits, right? And you'll end up with the numbers that go on the government-wide statement for governmental activities. So you've converted all the non-accruals, you've added in the accrual basis stuff, and now you've got, this is what gets reported out in the governmental activities columns. Okay, and once you're done, what ends up happening is the interfund balances disappear, long-term assets now appear, because remember, the long-term assets we weren't keeping in the governmental funds, and expenditures go away, because remember, in accrual-based accounting we're keeping track of expenses, so you've kind of adjusted everything to turn it into accrual basis. All right. So what I'd like to do is stop right here and talk about what we do with capital assets in the next video.